The rain fell steadily that night, a rhythmic patter against the leaves and the ground that seemed almost comforting at first. It was the kind of rain that made the world feel smaller, as though everything beyond the circle of firelight didn't exist. I was leading a Boy Scout camping trip deep in the Arkansas wilderness, a place known for its beauty and isolation. The Buffalo National River, with its towering bluffs and winding waters, was our backdrop, a stunning yet eerie reminder of nature's untamed power. We had set up camp on a quiet riverbank after paddling miles through the current. The boys' tents were pitched upstream, clustered together like a little village. My own tent stood alone, a small distance away. It wasn't by choice. I was nervous about sleeping alone, but the rules were clear. Male and female leaders couldn't share tents, even if it meant I had to brave the night on my own. Sam, my co-leader and an experienced camper, noticed my unease. He didn't say much, just set up his sleeping arrangement outside my tent. A simple sleeping pad on the ground, with his canoe flipped over him like a makeshift roof. I envied his confidence, the way he could lie there so exposed, as if nothing in the world could touch him. As the night wore on, the campfire burned low, and the boys' laughter faded into the stillness of the forest. I climbed into my tent, clutching a book to distract myself. The chill of the night seeped through the fabric, biting at my skin even through layers of clothing. Sleep wouldn't come. The cold gnawed at me, and the eerie silence outside felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. After what felt like hours, nature called. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself I could wait until morning, but the discomfort was too much. Reluctantly, I unzipped my tent and stepped into the freezing air. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow. The boys were silent, their tents barely visible in the distance. I tapped on Sam's canoe to let him know I was heading up the bank, though he didn't stir. The forest was a different place at night. The towering trees, so majestic in daylight, now loomed like dark sentinels. I climbed the embankment, careful not to slip on the wet ground, and ventured a few steps into the woods for privacy. That's when I noticed it, the silence. Not just the absence of voices or laughter, but the complete lack of sound. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the cold. I hurried back to camp, sliding down the embankment in my haste. Back at my tent, I grabbed a few rocks from the dying campfire, hoping their warmth would help me sleep. It didn't. The cold seemed to seep into my very bones, and I lay there shivering, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. Then I heard it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the riverbank downstream. The sound was faint but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. Was it one of the boys? No, it couldn't be. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving closer. I froze, barely breathing, as the footsteps reached the water. The sound changed, the soft splash of someone wading into the river. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, my hands trembling. In the dim light of the moon, I saw it. At first, I thought it was an elk, its massive form standing in the water. But something about it was wrong. Its shape was too tall, its movements too unnatural. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me. Even in the shadows, its face sent a jolt of primal fear through me. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong. My breath caught, and I ducked back into the tent, pulling the sleeping bag over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. I lay there, trembling, unable to sleep, my mind racing with questions and fears. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the cold and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been out there, something watching, something waiting. The cold night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, its shadowy figure, its unnatural stillness. My mind played tricks on me, conjuring sounds that weren't there, movements just outside my line of sight. Every rustle of the tent fabric felt like a whisper of something sinister. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I must have dozed off. But it wasn't a restful sleep. My dreams were fragmented, flashes of the river, the towering bluffs, and that face staring back at me from the shadows. I jolted awake at the faint sound of someone tapping on my tent. The voice that followed was low and familiar. "Come on out. It's time to go." Relief flooded me. It was morning. The worst was over. I rubbed my face and reached for my boots, grateful for the sunlight I expected to see when I stepped outside. But as I emerged from the tent, my heart sank. It wasn't morning. The moon still hung in the sky, casting its pale glow over the silent camp. No one was there. I stood frozen, the chill of the night air sinking into my skin. The voice had been so clear, so real. I scanned the campsite, but the boys' tents were still and undisturbed. Sam's canoe remained in its place, unmoved. The campfire was long dead, leaving nothing but cold embers. Then came the voice again, but this time it wasn't outside. It was in my head, clear and commanding. "Don't turn around." Every instinct screamed at me to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there. Yet, I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. Slowly, I backed into the tent, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the zipper. Once inside, I zipped it shut and pulled the sleeping bag over me, as though that thin layer of fabric could protect me from whatever was out there. I stayed like that for hours, curled up and shaking, listening to the deafening silence. The woods were still, unnaturally so, as if the entire world had gone into hiding. My mind raced with possibilities. Had one of the boys played a prank? Had I imagined the voice? But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there, and it wasn't human. The next thing I remember was waking up to sunlight streaming through the tent. The warmth on my face was a stark contrast to the icy terror of the night before. I unzipped the tent cautiously, half expecting to find something, or someone, waiting for me. But the camp was just as we'd left it. The boys were already up, bustling around the campfire as they prepared breakfast. Sam greeted me with a concerned look. "You look like you didn't sleep at all. Did you come to my tent last night?" His question hit me like a brick. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I heard someone walking around the camp," he said, gesturing toward the woods. "I thought it was you. You went up the embankment a few times, right?" My blood ran cold. "I only went once. Just once. And I came straight back." Sam's face darkened. He didn't say anything else, just nodded and went back to folding his sleeping pad. But his unease was clear. If it wasn't me walking around, then who or what had he heard? The rest of the morning passed in a blur. The boys were oblivious to the tension in the air, laughing and joking as they packed up their gear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had been out there last night hadn't left. As we loaded the canoes and pushed off from the riverbank, I couldn't help but glance back at the campsite. The shadows beneath the trees seemed darker than they should have been, as if something was hiding just out of sight. The river carried us away, but the fear stayed with me, a heavy weight I couldn't escape. The day passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease that had settled over me the night before refused to leave. As we paddled down the river, the stillness of the water mirrored the silence in my mind. The boys were laughing, but I couldn't join in. My thoughts kept drifting back to the night before, to that thing in the shadows, watching me, waiting. We stopped for lunch along a small, quiet stretch of the river. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting warm light on the water and the trees. But the warmth did little to ease the cold knot in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that something was lurking just out of sight, hidden in the trees along the riverbank. Sam must have noticed my distraction. He pulled me aside as the boys gathered their things. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I said, glancing nervously at the woods. "I keep thinking I'm being washed." Sam gave me a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're just tired. We've been on the river for a while now. Why don't you take a break, rest a bit?" I nodded, though I didn't feel any better. I couldn't explain it, but the woods seemed darker, more oppressive. The birds that usually filled the air with their songs were silent, and the wind had stopped altogether. The world felt suspended, as if waiting for something to happen. After a short rest, we packed up and continued our journey. The river was peaceful. It surfaced like glass, reflecting the trees and sky above. But my mind kept drifting back to that thing in the woods, that shape standing in the river, watching me. I tried to push the thought away, but it clung to me like a shadow, always just behind me. We camped that night at a different spot, farther from the river. The boys set up their tents in a circle, and I did the same. Sam and I sat by the fire, the flames crackling as we spoke in low tones. I could feel his eyes on me, as if he were waiting for me to say something. "I heard something last night," I said finally, breaking the silence. Sam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked into the fire, his face hardening. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It was like footsteps, but they weren't normal. Too heavy, too deliberate. And the voice? Sam, it wasn't a prank. It was real." He looked at me then, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the only one who heard it." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I heard it too," he said quietly. "Not the footsteps, but the voice. It was in my head. It told me not to turn around." The fire crackled loudly between us, the flames casting flickering shadows on Sam's face. His words hung in the air, thick with tension. I felt the weight of them settle on my chest. It wasn't just me. Something was out there, something that could speak to us, that could reach into our minds. We didn't speak again for a long time. The fire flickered and popped, sending embers into the air. The boys were inside their tents, and the camp had fallen silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from the darkness beyond the firelight. I lay in my tent at night, unable to sleep. The cold had returned, creeping into my bones, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the fear, the knowing that whatever was out there was still out there, waiting. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. The night stretched on endlessly, and every sound outside my tent seemed amplified, as though the forest was alive with whispers and movements. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves and branches, but still, there was something wrong about it. It wasn't a natural wind. It was like the forest itself was trying to warn us. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps again, slow and deliberate, crunching on the ground outside my tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to listen. They were too close this time, too close to ignore. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my pulse racing. I couldn't see anything through the fabric of the tent, but I knew it was out there. I could feel it. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and I heard a faint rustle, as though something was brushing against the fabric. I stayed frozen, too afraid to move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it Sam? Had he come to check on me? But no, these steps were different. They were heavier, more deliberate, and there was no voice this time, no warning. I held my breath, hoping it would pass, hoping whatever it was would move on. But it didn't. The footsteps stayed there, just outside, as though whatever was out there was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a sound, to make a move. I finally gathered enough courage to unzip the tent just a fraction, my hand trembling as I did. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting pale shadows across the ground. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the silent forest. I exhaled in relief, but the feeling didn't last long. Something wasn't right. I could feel it deep in my bones, the sense that we were being hunted, that whatever was out there was getting closer. Let me know if this works for you or if you'd like any changes. The next morning, the forest was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were gone, replaced by a heavy stillness that seemed to hang in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something waiting for the right moment to strike. Sam noticed my unease, and his expression had shifted too. He wasn't the same easygoing guy from the first day of the trip. Now, his eyes darted around constantly, and his movements were quick, almost jerky, as if he were always on guard. I caught him glancing over his shoulder more than once, and his hand never strayed far from the knife at his belt. The rest of the boys were acting like everything was normal, laughing and joking as we packed up camp. But I could see the tension in their eyes, the way they looked around, as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. They didn't say anything, but I knew they felt it too. The fear that had settled over me was spreading, infecting all of us. We set out again, paddling down the river in silence. The water was unnaturally still, the surface smooth like glass. The trees along the bank were thick, their branches heavy with leaves, and the sunlight barely pierced through the canopy above. It felt like we were in a world apart, a place where time didn't exist, and every movement was watched. I tried to focus on the task at hand, trying to ignore the creeping dread that gnawed at my insides. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that we were being followed. The trees seemed to shift as we passed, their shadows stretching unnaturally long, as if reaching for us. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. We stopped for lunch by the river again, though none of us had much of an appetite. We ate in silence, each of us too on edge to speak. The sound of the river flowing seemed distant, muffled, as if the forest was swallowing it up. It was at that moment that I heard it, the faintest sound, barely a whisper, coming from the woods behind us. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The others didn't seem to notice, but I knew they had to have heard it too. It was a voice, low and soft, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't the voice from the night before. It was something else, something new. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked around, trying to locate the source. But there was nothing. Just the trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Sam, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it." Who's out there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sam didn't answer. He just looked at the others, his eyes wide with fear. I could see the same unease in their faces. They knew, just like I did, that something was wrong, that we weren't alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We paddled down the river, stopping only to set up camp again as the sun dipped below the horizon. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer as night fell, and the air grew colder, sharper. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the river flowing was distant, almost drowned out by the beating of my own heart. The others were silent in their tents, but I knew they were awake too, listening for anything that might give away the presence of whatever was out there. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, my mind racing. What was it? What was following us? And why? The sound of footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, like the night before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam of light into the darkness. Nothing. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were closer now, right outside the tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the soft brush of branches against the ground. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would just leave us alone. Then I heard the voice again, soft, almost melodic, but carrying an unmistakable tone of malice. "You can't hide," it whispered. "We are always watching." I froze. The voice was in my head again, just like before. But this time, it wasn't just a warning. It felt like a threat. I bolted upright, heart pounding in my chest. "Sam." I called, but my voice came out in a strangled whisper. I didn't want to wake the others. I didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. I grabbed my things and scrambled out of the tent, not caring if anyone saw me. The night air hit me like a cold slap, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I had to find out what was happening. The forest was still, too still, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, hidden in the darkness. I stepped cautiously into the trees, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadows shifted around me, and I could hear something moving in the underbrush, something just out of sight. I turned sharply, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. Its shape was tall, indistinct, but there was something about it that made my blood run cold. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, 2 points of light staring straight at me. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground, my breath ragged in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps again, faster this time, closer. I ran until I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't stop until I found myself back at the camp, panting and out of breath. The others were still asleep, unaware of what I had just seen. But I knew that whatever it wasn't done with us yet. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The camp was quiet, the sun shining through the trees, and the sounds of birds chirping filled the air. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. It was as if the night hadn't happened, but it had. I had seen something I couldn't explain. And now, I felt like it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I sat by the fire, trying to push the fear away. The others were starting to wake up, stretching and yawning as they got out of their tents. Sam was the last to rise, his face pale and tired, like he hadn't slept at all. "You okay?" I asked him quietly, not wanting to alarm the others. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear that hadn't been there before. "Yeah, just didn't sleep much." I didn't push him. I could see it in his face. He knew something was wrong too. He had heard the voice, just like I had. He had felt the same fear, the same presence. The others were oblivious, laughing and joking as they packed up their gear. But I could see the change in them too. They weren't as carefree as they had been the day before. There was an underlying tension in their movements, like they were all trying to ignore the unease that was creeping into their hearts. We paddled down the river again, but this time, there was no laughter. No jokes. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself was pressing in on us. The water was still, almost unnaturally so, and the trees along the bank seemed to loom over us, casting long shadows that stretched across the river like dark fingers. The silence was oppressive. The only sound was the soft splash of the paddles as we made our way downstream. Every so often, I thought I heard something in the woods, footsteps, a whisper on the wind. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I tried to focus on the journey, tried to ignore the gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach, but it was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it again, the voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You can't run," it said. "We know where you are." My heart skipped a beat. The others didn't seem to hear it, but I did. And Sam did too. I saw him stiffen, his hand tightening around the paddle. He glanced at me, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to make camp." Sam nodded without saying a word. He didn't need to speak. We both knew that something was wrong, and we needed to stay alert. The others didn't question us. They just followed our lead, setting up camp near the riverbank once again. The night was quiet, too quiet. The air was thick, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muffled, like the world was holding its breath. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the woods, the glowing eyes, the tall, indistinct shape that had been watching me. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to ignore the sounds outside. The others were asleep, but I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. We had to get out. We had to leave before whatever was in the forest found us. I glanced over at Sam's tent, but it was dark. I couldn't see if he was awake or not, but I knew he was. We were both too afraid to sleep. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. It came from the woods just beyond the camp. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer. It was coming toward us. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make a sound. My fingers trembled as I grabbed it and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The scraping sound continued, but now there was something else. A low, guttural growl, like an animal in pain. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, and I fought the urge to run. I had to stay calm. I had to figure out what it was. The growl came again, closer now, and I could hear the soft thud of footsteps in the dirt. Whatever it was big. Too big. Suddenly, there was a crash, like something large breaking through the trees. I jumped, the flashlight slipping from my grip and falling to the ground with a clatter. I scrambled to pick it up, but the beam of light flickered out. I cursed under my breath, heart racing. The growling stopped, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, loud in the silence. I slowly stood up, my legs shaking, and unzipped the tent. I peeked outside, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, dark and still. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was out there, it was still watching us, still waiting. The sun rose slowly the next morning, but the sense of unease never left. The woods were still quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects eerily absent. We packed up quickly, each of us working in silence, the tension palpable in the air. No one spoke about what had happened the night before, but we all knew something was wrong. Sam and I exchanged a glance as we loaded the canoe, both of us feeling the same gnawing fear. The others seemed oblivious, chatting amongst themselves as they worked, but their laughter was hollow, forced. They were trying to ignore the weight of the fear pressing down on them, but it was there, just beneath the surface. I didn't want to stay another night. I wanted to leave, to head back to civilization, but we were too far in. Turning back now would mean a long, exhausting journey, and we couldn't afford to waste time. But I had a feeling that staying in these woods was just as dangerous. The river was calm, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't name. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the water, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every time we paddled past a bend, I half expected to see something, anything, emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty woods. We stopped for lunch on a small island in the middle of the river. The others were laughing again, though it sounded strained, as if they were trying to convince themselves everything was fine. Sam and I sat apart from them, each of us lost in our thoughts, staring out over the water. It was then that I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible among the trees. I blinked, thinking it was just my imagination, but when I looked again, it was still there. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and its form was shrouded in shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching us. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, like the embers of a dying fire. I felt my heart stop. I wanted to shout, to warn the others, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the trees, melting into the shadows like it had never been there at all. I stood up quickly, my breath coming in short gasps. Sam noticed, his eyes widening in alarm. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, what the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was real. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. "We need to leave," I said urgently, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Sam didn't argue. He grabbed his gear, and we both turned toward the others, who were still eating and talking, unaware of what had just happened. "We need to go," Sam said, his voice shaking. "Something's out there." The others looked at us, confused, but there was something in our faces, something that told them we weren't joking. Slowly, they packed up, the tension thick in the air. We didn't speak as we paddled away, the silence between us louder than any words could be. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the trees, dark and still. As the hours passed, the sense of dread only grew. The river seemed to stretch on endlessly, the banks lined with dense, uninviting forest. The further we went, the more isolated we felt, as if the world was shrinking around us. Night was falling again, and I knew we couldn't keep going much longer. We needed to find a place to camp, but I didn't want to stay in these woods any longer than I had to. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. We finally made camp on a small clearing near the river. It was the best we could do, but it didn't feel safe. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning the darkening forest for any sign of movement. As the others set up their tents, I stayed close to Sam, my nerves on edge. He didn't speak, but I could tell he was feeling the same way. The silence was oppressive, the weight of the forest pressing in on us from all sides. I heard the scraping sound again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the woods just beyond the clearing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Sam heard it too. He looked at me, his face grim. "It's back," he said quietly. I nodded, my mind racing. We had to stay alert. We had to be ready for whatever was out there. The night passed slowly, each minute stretching on forever. I lay awake in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The others were asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then, in the distance, I heard it again, the voice. "You can't escape," it whispered, faint but clear. "We're coming for you." My blood ran cold. The night seemed endless, the air thick with the sense that something was waiting. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what we had seen, what we had heard. The voice was still echoing in my head, its chilling whisper haunting me even in the silence of the dark. I lay in my tent, staring up at the canvas above me, my ears straining for any sound. The others were still asleep, but I knew they couldn't hear it, the soft rustling, the almost imperceptible whispers coming from the trees. I wanted to wake them, to tell them that we weren't safe, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the realization that they wouldn't believe me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that something was out there, and it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Sam had been awake too, I could tell. His silhouette was barely visible through the fabric of the tent, moving restlessly, as if he too could feel the unease settling around us. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We were trapped, isolated in this dark forest with no way out. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The rustling continued, and this time, it was closer. My heart began to race as I strained to listen. There was something out there, something moving in the shadows. My mind kept telling me to stay calm, to wait it out until morning, but my instincts were screaming at me to run. And then, there it was again, the voice. "Leave this place," it whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. "You don't belong here." I bolted upright, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know if it was the fear or the exhaustion, but I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The others still hadn't woken up, oblivious to the danger lurking just outside our camp. I crawled out of my tent, my legs shaking beneath me. Sam was already there, standing near the fire pit, his face pale and drawn. He looked just as terrified as I felt. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he replied, his eyes wide. "But we need to leave. Now." He didn't need to say it again. We both knew that staying here any longer was a death sentence. We hurried to wake the others, shaking them awake, urging them to pack up. They were disoriented at first, but when they saw the fear in our eyes, they didn't argue. They moved quickly, gathering their gear, but there was a hesitation in their movements, as if they too could feel a presence that was closing in on us. The fire had long since burned out, leaving us in darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the stars overhead, but it wasn't enough to banish the shadows that seemed to stretch across the forest. Every tree, every rock, every movement in the distance seemed to hold something watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed our things and rushed to the canoes, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the thick forest floor. The river was our only escape, but I didn't know if it would be enough. I didn't know if we would make it out alive. As we pushed the canoes into the water, I couldn't help but look back one last time. The woods were still, but there was something about the silence that felt wrong. It was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We paddled away, the sound of the oars slicing through the water, the only noise breaking the stillness. The river was narrow here, the banks lined with dense trees that blocked out the sky. It felt like we were being swallowed by the forest, the trees closing in around us. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything, emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, the oppressive silence that hung over us like a weight. It felt like we were being hunted. We paddled through the night, our muscles aching, our bodies exhausted, but none of us dared to stop. We couldn't afford to rest. Not while we were still so close to the forest. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we had covered a significant distance. The river was widening now, the trees starting to thin out, but the feeling of dread still lingered. We hadn't escaped yet, not by a long shot. We pulled the canoes ashore, exhausted but unwilling to stop. The forest was behind us now, but I still felt the presence, like something was watching us from the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. We made camp again, but this time, we didn't feel safe. We didn't speak much, each of us lost in our own thoughts, too afraid to acknowledge the terror that had followed us from the woods. The day passed slowly, the air thick with tension. We didn't know what was out there, or why it was following us, but we knew we couldn't stay here forever. We had to keep moving. That night, as we sat around the fire, I heard the voice again. It was faint, distant, but it was there. "You can't escape," it whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "You're not free." My blood ran cold. We weren't safe. Not yet. We didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The voice, the whispers, the eerie feeling that we were being hunted. It all lingered, gnawing at our nerves. We sat around the fire, the crackling flames the only sound in the stillness, each of us lost in our own thoughts, too scared to speak. By morning, we had made up our minds. We couldn't stay here any longer. The river had taken us this far, but we needed to leave. The sense of being watched, of being followed, was too much. The forest had eyes, and they were fixed on us, waiting. "We're leaving," Sam said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but firm, as if he had made peace with the decision, even if none of us had. No one argued. We packed our things in silence, each of us moving like robots, too tired, too scared to do anything else. We had no plan, no idea where we were going, but we couldn't stay here. The sooner we got away from the forest, the better. The day was overcast, the sky a dull gray that matched the heaviness in the air. The river seemed wider now, the current stronger, as if it was trying to push us forward, urging us to leave the darkness behind. We paddled in silence, the water swirling around us, carrying us downstream. The further we went, the more I felt the tension in my body ease, but it wasn't enough. The feeling of being followed still clung to me like a shadow, and every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees. But there was nothing. Only the forest, stretching out on either side of the river, silent and still. Hours passed, and the feeling of dread began to fade, replaced by exhaustion. We hadn't eaten much, and the hunger gnawed at my stomach, but there was no time to stop. We had to keep moving. By late afternoon, the river opened up into a vast, wide expanse. The trees were far behind us now, and the land around us was flat and barren. We could finally breathe a little easier. We had made it out of the forest, out of the darkness that had seemed to close in around us. But the question still lingered in my mind. What had been out there? What had been watching us, following us? As we pulled the canoes ashore, I felt the weight of the silence settle over us once more. The world around us seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. We set up camp, the fire crackling as we huddled around it, each of us trying to push the fear out of our minds. But the fear wouldn't go away. It was as if the forest had marked us, left something behind, and no matter how far we ran, we couldn't escape it. That night, as I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, I heard the voice again. It was faint, but it was there, a whisper in the wind. "You can never leave," it said. "The forest will always find you." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I had heard it in my mind or if it was real, but the terror was unmistakable. We weren't safe. Not yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with us. It had let us go, yes, but only for now. The whispers were a warning, a reminder that it was still watching, still waiting. And as I lay there in the dark, I realized that the worst was yet to come. The next morning, we broke camp early. We were all tired, drained, but there was no rest for us. The sense of urgency hung over us, a constant reminder that we couldn't linger. Every time we stopped to take a breath, I felt like we were losing precious time, like the forest was slowly closing in on us again. We set off across the flat land, walking in a single line, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the sound of our footsteps the only noise breaking the silence. The day was still overcast, and a light drizzle began to fall, the droplets soaking into our clothes, but we barely noticed. The cold was nothing compared to the cold fear that had settled in our bones. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon something that made our hearts stop. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the mist, a shadow in the distance. But as we got closer, the figure became clearer. It was standing in the middle of the barren land, motionless, like a statue. A man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by a hood. His hands were outstretched, palms open, as if waiting for something. "Who is that?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, and a sick feeling was rising in my stomach. It felt wrong. This man, he shouldn't be here. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We approached cautiously, keeping a safe distance, but the figure didn't move. It was as if he was frozen in place, waiting for us to come closer. As we drew near, I could feel the weight of his presence, even without seeing his face. "Hello," Sam called out, his voice tentative. There was no response. The man didn't even flinch. I felt a strange pull toward him, like an invisible force was drawing me in. I wanted to move away, to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, just like his. And then, I heard it. The voice again. "You're not free," it whispered, faint but unmistakable. "You will never be free." The words sent a chill down my spine. I turned to look at the others, but they were just as frozen as I was, their eyes wide with fear, their faces pale. Suddenly, the figure lifted his head. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his gaze, as if his eyes were piercing right through me. "You have been chosen," he said, his voice deep and hollow, like the sound of wind howling through empty caves. "There is no escape. You are part of the forest now." And then, without warning, the figure vanished. One moment he was there, standing in front of us, and the next, nothing. No sign of him, no trace. Just the emptiness of the land around us. We stood there, staring at the spot where he had been, our breaths shallow, our hearts racing. What the hell was that? Mark finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice shaking. "But I don't think we're alone anymore." The air felt thick, like the very atmosphere was closing in on us. The forest, the river, the man. We weren't running from just a place anymore. We were running from something much darker, something ancient, something that had been waiting for us. We kept moving, but now, every step felt like a betrayal. Every movement felt like we were drawing closer to something we couldn't escape, something that would follow us wherever we went. The whispering had started again, faint but constant. "You can never leave. You are ours." I didn't know how much more I could take. We were so close to the end, and yet it felt like the beginning of something far worse. The whispers were all around us now, louder, more insistent. And I realized then, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that we had made a terrible mistake. There was no escaping the forest, no escaping whatever was hunting us. It had already found us. The whispers grew louder, as if the very earth itself was speaking to us, telling us things we didn't want to hear. Each step we took felt like we were sinking deeper into something that wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, a force that didn't want us to leave. I glanced around at the others. Sam's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Mark was breathing heavily, his hand gripping the handle of his knife so tightly his knuckles were white. I wanted to say something, to comfort them, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? We were all in the same nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. The path ahead seemed endless. No matter how far we walked, the forest didn't seem to change. It was like we were trapped in a loop, going around in circles, always coming back to the same place, the same feeling of dread pressing down on us. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, felt like a threat. "Why are we still moving?" Sam finally asked, his voice cracking. "We're not getting anywhere." I didn't know how to answer. I didn't have the strength to tell him the truth, that there was no way out. That we were being hunted, not by an animal or a person, but by something older, something that had seen countless lives come and go. We were just another part of its story, another group of fools who thought they could escape its grip. But then, as we walked, I saw something ahead that made my heart stop. A clearing. A patch of open ground, bathed in a strange, otherworldly light. It was like a beacon, a sign of hope, or maybe a trap. I moved forward, my legs heavy, my heart pounding. The others followed, but there was no energy in their steps, just the same resignation that had taken over all of us. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I felt it, the presence. It was there, waiting for us, watching us with unseen eyes. The air was thick, and I could taste the bitterness in my mouth. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but I knew it would be pointless. In the center of the clearing stood a stone structure, ancient and weathered, with symbols carved into it that I didn't recognize. The ground around it was cracked, as if the earth itself had been torn apart. It looked like a place of power, a place where something ancient had been sealed away. "We need to go," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "This place, it's wrong." I nodded, but my feet wouldn't move. I was drawn to the structure, as if something was calling me, urging me to step closer. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind that presses in on you until you feel like you're suffocating. Then, the ground trembled. A low, rumbling sound, like something huge was stirring beneath us. The structure in the center of the clearing began to glow, the symbols on it lighting up with an eerie, unnatural light. And I realized then, with a shock of horror, that we weren't alone. We had never been alone. The forest wasn't just alive, it was watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. "We need to leave," I whispered, but it was too late. The ground cracked open, and from the darkness beneath, something began to rise. It was huge, monstrous, a shape that seemed to twist and shift, like it was made of shadows and nightmares. The air around us grew cold, freezing our breath, and I knew, deep in my gut, that there was no escape. The thing loomed over us, its form a mast of shifting darkness, its eyes glowing like coals. It spoke, but its voice wasn't heard. It was felt, a deep, bone-shaking sensation that made my chest ache. "You are mine," it said, and the world around us seemed to crumble. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen in place, just like the others. The thing reached out, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around us, pulling us into the darkness. And then, just like that, it was over. The forest fell silent once more. We were gone. But the forest would wait. It always waits.